Hi, Assalamualaikum and greetings everyone. So this is our revision notes. So I've prepared this on Padlet, and after this I'm going to print out in the form of PDF. So don't worry too much about the notes, just listen and try to understand. So this time around we are going to look at the component based on culture and development. So we are not going to do revision based on the weekly lessons, rather based on the two components, culture and development. So let's look at culture first. So if we look here very carefully, culture, what is culture? Culture is the way of life which includes costumes, rituals, practices, language, arts, food and others. So basically, ladies and gentlemen, when you talk about culture as a way of life, you must actually include life in a specific community. So the definition, a proper definition, culture is the way of life in a specific community, which includes ritual, practices, costumes, language, and whatever that you want to include as part of culture, because it is a way of life. So under culture, we have several critical concepts or key concepts. In our class, I always mention critical concepts. So let's have a look at these critical concepts one by one. So let us begin with cultural determinism. So when you talk about cultural determinism, what is it? What does it mean by cultural determinism? Basically, your behaviors, your actions are dictated by the events or behaviors or actions in the past. So basically, you can actually predict what will happen today based on similar actions from the past. So that is cultural determinism. And then we look at the second one, cultural relativism. You cannot judge others based on your values. You just compare and judge silently. So this is how you do it. Most of the time, all of us will have cultural relativism. But again, it is not fair to just compare others based on your values. So you do not judge. So the key concept, do not judge. So that's number one. Number two, if you do judge, if you do judge, you just judge in your heart, you do not tell others. So that is cultural relativism. The minute you tell other people about how you feel about something, it becomes cultural ethnocentrism. So you believe that you are superior than others. So your assumption is that your culture is the best. So your culture is number one. Your culture is the best. So no other cultures can compete or can be compared to your cultures. So there are three characteristics of cultural ethnocentrism. The first one, this cultural ethnocentrism contributes to social solidarity. Social solidarity means that you just stick together with your own members of your culture. You don't mix around. So that is solidarity. Second, familiar expectations among members. You have the same expectations among your members of your society. Of course, you do not expect other people to understand that because they are not from your culture. So familiar expectations amongst members. And last but not least, you think different behaviors as strange simply because your culture does not support, or your culture feels that this is not supposed to happen. Then if other cultures do it, or if members of other cultures perform it, then that is strange. So basically, that is cultural ethnocentrism. The minute you start to judge and then you start to talk about it, other people about this feeling that you feel that is not right, so that is cultural ethnocentrism. So basically, cultural determinism, you can predict the action of today based on the results of the past actions, similar past actions. And then cultural relativism, you do not judge other people. And cultural ethnocentrism, the belief that your culture is superior than others. Now, let's have a look at keys to understanding. So we have here keys to understanding. We have three keys. Three keys. The first one, respect. Respect others' opinions, practices, and values. So normally respect is a feeling of admiration towards someone or something, or yeah, basically you admire someone or something, and that's why you actually give your respect to that something or someone. So of course, when you respect other people, you not only respect the person as a person, but you respect his or her opinions, his or her practices, and his or her values. So that's the first key. The second key is tolerance. So basically, tolerance is the act of taking and giving, or giving and taking. For example, you take something from other people, and because of that you give something to other people. So this is actually mutual kind of understanding. So tolerance. Last but not least, acceptance. Now this is the most difficult for us to achieve. Acceptance is when you accept as a whole. You expect people. Let's say when you look at people, you expect him or her to be, some sort of a good person or a bad person. So you accept as a whole. So acceptance, accept as a whole the value of that people, either bad or good values, you have to accept. So three keys to understanding: respect, tolerance, and then acceptance. Now let's have a look at layers of cultures. Layers of cultures. Basically we have 6 layers of culture. The first one, we have a national culture, and then we have a regional culture, and then we have a gender, we have generation, we have social class, and last but not least, corporate level. So what does it mean by layers of cultures? Basically, if you talk about a national layer of culture, you're talking about whatever practices accepted by all members of Malaysia. That means all citizens or all Malaysian citizens accept something. So that is national layers of cultures. And then we have regional. Of course, Malaysia, the neighbors, Singapore, we have Thailand, and then we have the Philippines, Brunei, Vietnam, so Indonesia. So all these our neighbors in the region, and some of the practices are the same. So for example, batik, or for example, nasi goreng between Indonesia and Malaysia. So that's the meaning of regional layers of culture. And then we have gender. Gender layers, basically there's only 2 genders, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to repeat this: 2 genders, male and female. And of course, in terms of communication, for example, you can see that there are differences between how a lady speaks or expresses her emotions, and the way a gentleman expresses or speaks. So basically there are differences, not only in terms of communication, in terms of expressing emotions, in terms of doing things, in terms of walking, in terms of eating, for example. So that's the meaning of gender layers of culture. And then we have a generation. So basically, according to a social scientist, one generation, we will count it as 50 years, and some social scientists argue that it is 25 years. So basically, for example, I am now 50 years old. So if let's say we are using the first argument, 50 years, then we change the generation. That means between myself and yourself, we are one generation difference. If let's say it is 25, perhaps we are still in the same generation era. So basically, generation, how we communicate, how we perceive something, how we give our opinion, of course will be different, because whatever that I was exposed to, you did not get the same kind of exposure, because of how the world or how our country has evolved, how the world has evolved. So basically that's generation. And then we are talking about social class. Social class means, in the simplest term that I can actually give you as an example, B40, M40, T20. that's, I think, we started to have that kind of division, social class division, about 5 years, 6 years ago. So that means if you are talking about how, or if you are trying to understand how a B40 student and how a T20 student look at life, of course there will be major differences, simply because they were, brought up differently. So social class. And then another way of looking at social class is actually between, for example, royalties and us as the commoners. So that's also social class. Most of the time in Malaysia, when you talk about social class, it's all about the educational background and of course about the economic background. So basically, education will influence the economic background. So that's social class. And then we're talking about corporate layers of culture. What does it mean by corporate layers of culture? Basically, each organization has its own corporate cultures. For example, if you look at the military institution, the military itself has its specific and unique corporate culture. It's very different from the civilian culture. So basically, layers of cultures, we have 6, not necessarily in order when you want to explain them, but you can just randomly pick anything that you want to explain, not in order. So when you talk about layers of cultures, we also need to talk about how the people, or how members of a community communicate amongst themselves and with each other, meaning people from outside of the community. So first we need to understand in terms of sequential culture versus synchronic culture. What does it mean by this? This is when people from different cultures, how they actually see time, how they value time. So sequential culture means that people in this group, they perform tasks one task at a time. So they see time as a community. They value time. They really look at time as something that is very important in their life, because it is a community. In comparison to people from synchronic cultures, people in synchronic cultures, they are multitask. They can perform multiple tasks simultaneously or concurrently. So this is when you talk about people, when you talk about layers of culture, you have to look at the background of the people, the background of the cultures, how they see time. So how they see time, we can have sequential and then we can have synchronic culture. At the same time, we must also look at how communities or cultures look at emotions. So basically we have affective versus neutral cultures. So people in affective cultures, they are good and not shy to show their real emotions at the time. So if they are sad, they will just cry in front of you. If they are mad, they will just, shout or scream at you. So they are not afraid to show their emotions. And on the other hand, if you are talking about neutral cultures, the members of this culture normally do not exhibit or do not show their emotions. But that does not mean they do not have emotions. They do. It's just that they do not actually show or tell us that they are happy or they are sad. So you cannot predict how they feel. They have the feeling. They are sad, they are mad, they are happy, but it's not exhibited. It's not shown on their faces. So they do not want to share simply because it is a mechanism to protect themselves, or simply they are not trained to do it. But whatever it is, we do have affective and neutral cultures. The other one is in terms of how they actually communicate, how these different groups of cultures communicate. So we have high context versus low context culture. Now, high context cultures mean that people in these cultures, they emphasize interpersonal relationships. They develop trust and they feel that whatever that they want to do, they will ask for permission. So for example, in Malaysia, we are so high context culture. Basically, we respect our elderly, we listen to opinions of others, especially those who are older than us. So we are basically collectivists. We do things together. And in comparison to that, we have low context culture. This is where people or members of this culture, they are logical, linear, individualistic, and action oriented. So people from this low context culture, they are very direct, but they are very logical. So when they actually solve problem, they will actually present all the facts, all related facts, and then when they discuss, normally it will end into an action. So they don't just discuss, talk about it without doing anything. They have discussions and then they take action. So that's in terms of how, when you talk about layers of cultures, we need to understand the three groupings: sequential, synchronic, affective and neutral, as well as high context and low context culture. Now moving on, let's talk about of course, when you talk about affective or high context, low context, there are differences. People in this world, we are different from one to the other depending on a lot of things. A lot of factors will actually influence all this. So how do we measure cultural differences? So we have 4 indices that we can use in order to measure cultural differences. The first one is masculinity index. This is where you see whether a particular culture is actually male dominated or female dominated. And then we have power distance index. This is where you can see, for example, in the relation of a teacher and students. So you can see that although the teacher can listen to the opinions of the students, but most of the time the students will just have to listen to whatever that the teacher is saying, simply because there's a power distance. And then we talk about uncertainty avoidance index. So this is where most of the time we have members of a particular group or culture who will just shy away or run away from any kind of issues or crisis, simply because they just want to avoid. If you're not sure of anything, if they're not sure of anything, they just let go. So that is number 3. And last but not least, we have individualism index. So this is where you see people in cultures such as high context and low context culture. So for low context culture, they are very individualistic. So this is where you will be able to measure the differences between individualistic cultures as well as collectivist cultures. So we have high context and low context culture, which can be measured by individualism index. So that's on that. And then another key concepts related to culture, or that come under culture, would be cultural assimilation and cultural adaptation. So basically, when you talk about cultural assimilation, it resembles the dominant cultures in terms of language, behaviors, or the way you dress. So normally this is in a short period of time as well as a long period of time. So I'm going to add this here, in a short period of time, and also can be a long term process. So update, yep. So basically, when you talk about cultural assimilation, it is a process where it can take a long or a short period of time. So what happens is that the members trying to assimilate, they will try to resemble the dominant cultures in terms of the language use, in terms of the behaviors, in terms of how he or she dresses and all those. And in comparison to that, cultural adaptation, this is where the process of becoming part of a new culture, and it's normally taking a long time. in order for you to adapt to become a part of a new culture. Especially if you are students studying overseas or abroad, sometimes when you return home, you are still not adapting fully or appropriately to the new culture, because when you come back, of course, whatever that you have adapted will be like forgotten, because you are back home to your home country. Okay, so that's cultural assimilation, cultural adaptation. And then there's one more categories before we move into the last one under culture. So let's talk about ICT and cultures. So what are the impacts of ICT on cultures? We have a global village and no boundaries. Meaning to say, if you're talking about contacting or getting in touch with people from America, for example, you don't need to wait for his or her time. You can just email, and then he or she can read your email at his or her convenience. So basically, that's the impact, no boundaries. And then of course, everybody become the citizens of the world, global village. So that's the impact. Now, what about the challenges? There are challenges in terms of ICT and cultures. The first one is the challenge to preserve the cultural practices, and the second one is actually the challenge to maintain language and identity. So basically, when you talk about the internet, when you talk about the globalization, the language used, majority would be English. So what will happen to, for us, for example, Bahasa Melayu, simply because we are not able to use Bahasa Melayu with the other members of the world. So we have to actually, I'm not saying that we have to compromise our identity in terms of our Bahasa Melayu, but then again, we have to think about these are the challenges in terms of maintaining language and identity. So that's under ICT and cultures, and this one is actually making cultural assimilation and cultural adaptation as part of the discussion. Now let's talk about persuasive communication. What does it mean by persuasive communication? Actually, when we try to understand layers of cultures, we have to look at sequential, synchronic, affective, neutral, as well as high context versus low context culture. But it comes also under persuasive communication when you want to try and influence people, when you want to try to sell your ideas, when you want to try to negotiate, you have to have this understanding. First, you must consider the audience. Who are you negotiating with? So that's where the understanding of the knowledge of high context culture, low context culture, for example, comes in. The types of media when you want to share information, that is very critical as well. Are you going to meet the person face to face or physically, or are you going to call the person, or are you going to send an email? So that's the types of media. And then, as I said just now, all this persuasive communication will try to actually force you to use your knowledge of high context culture, low context culture, sequential culture, synchronic culture, as well as affective culture and neutral culture. So that's under persuasive communication. And then when you talk about persuasion therapy, it is very culture specific. What does it mean by persuasion therapy? Basically, in all cultures, we have this one aspect in our life. The teenagers today call it healing. How do you heal yourself? How do you try to comfort yourself? So healing, that's the term today. But in social science, we talk about persuasion therapy. In Malaysia, for example, for Muslim students or Muslim parents, when they talk about persuasion therapy, they will always go back to reciting or reading Al-Quran, for example. So that's that. It is very culture specific. So for Malay society, majority or all Malays in Malaysia, they are Muslims, so they will go to Al-Quran. So that's the example, persuasion therapy. In the West, they will go to therapists. 1 hour, $400 for the therapist or the psychiatrist to listen to your problem. So it is a huge money there in this business in the West, but not in Malaysia. Okay, so that's one more before we go to the national, local, popular cultures. This is actually our last lesson for the semester: tangible versus intangible cultures. So what does it mean by tangible and intangible? So tangible cultures, they are cultures that we can see, we can touch, and of course that we can feel. So two categories under this: movable cultures, for example, your books, the chairs, the tables, something that you can move, and then immovable cultures. So this is where, when you talk about buildings, for example, you talk about the mosque, you talk about, for example, temples. So they cannot be moved simply because, you know, they are so huge and so heavy. So what you can do, you can see, you can touch. So that is tangible. And intangible cultures, on the other hand, are cultures that you can see sometimes, you can feel, of course, but you cannot touch. For example, if you're talking about wedding rituals, you can see the wedding, you can actually feel sadness, let's say, or happiness of a wedding, but you cannot touch the wedding. Who are you going to touch if you're talking about the wedding? So the concept or the abstract concept of the wedding itself cannot be touched. So that's why it is intangible. Both tangible and intangible cultures, they give identity and mark groups of people. Of course, for example, if you're talking about Malay wedding, then you know those getting married, the bride and the groom, they are from Malay cultures. So that's the meaning of tangible and intangible cultures. Moving on to our last lesson under culture would be national culture, local culture, and popular culture. So national culture, practices that are accepted and used by all Malaysians, regardless of the races, regardless of the locations. So that's national culture. And then we talk about local culture. So local culture practices in a particular community or culture, and where the practice is just accepted in that particular culture. So for example, sari can only not can only be worn, but most of the time it's just worn in Indian communities. So that's the meaning of that. So remember, national culture accepted by all Malaysians regardless of locations and races. Local culture accepted by members of that particular culture only. And then we have another term, popular culture. So normally popular culture, they are practices based on trends. It's not going to be forever, unlike national culture and local culture. So it's based on trends. So for example, when I was a student, Bollywood was the popular trend, but today still K-pop. So I'm not sure when K-pop will end, but it is still in running, in progress as a popular culture in the world, not only in Malaysia but in the world. So let's have a look at the blue colored notes that we have and see whether we have covered all notes. I think so, we have covered all notes. Now let's go to this pink colored one here in the middle, National Cultural Policy. National Cultural Policy, NCP. So what is NCP? Introduced in 1970. It is a guideline for promoting peace and harmony in Malaysia. So this guide actually inform the government of the day as well as the policy makers about what must be done in order to promote harmony and peace in the country. So there are three aspects or components or elements of the national cultural policy. The first one, whatever activities or promotions or something that you want to promote at the national level must be based on the indigenous cultures. So indigenous cultures for Malaysia would be Malay culture. And then we talk about the second aspect, practices from other cultures apart from Malay culture that are suitable can also be included as part of the national level cultures. So basically, if let's say we want to do number 2, if we want to promote local cultures to become national cultures, then it must follow number 3. Islam is the basis for the policy. So listen very carefully, ladies and gentlemen. A lot of us have misunderstood what this national cultural policy is. 3 aspects. The first one, the national culture must be based on the indigenous cultures, and for Malaysia it is the Malay culture. However, number 2, if let's say practices from other cultures, for example the Chinese or the Indians, if they are suitable to be promoted as part of the national culture, then they have to follow number 3. Islam is the basis for the policy. So for example, if we take sari, so sari, if sari wants to be promoted as a national costume, then the sari must be Sharia compliance. That means those who wear sari must cover everything, because Islam is the basis for the policy. So that's national cultural policy. Now, the bridge between culture and development is actually the national cultural policy. So that's why it is in the middle here. So let's have a look at development. So for development, we don't really have a lot, but they are quite tough to really understand. So let's have a look at development. What is development? Development is a positive and or negative improvement. So don't be surprised, we also have negative improvement. How? For example, I am a thief. So when I was a junior thief, I only know one trick to steal something. But then as I grew older, I learned how to have more tricks in order to steal something. From one trick to 5 tricks, for example, to steal something. So that is improvement, ladies and gentlemen. However, it is negative improvement. So development, positive and or negative improvement. So let's talk about the types of development. We have two types of development. The first one is development as process, and the second one is development as intention. So under the first type of development, we have 2 subtypes, or I wrote here 2 subcategories. So maybe not categories, because this can be quite confusing because we use different terms. So types, and maybe I will write here types, type 1, so that when I actually convert this into a PDF format, that would be easier for you to read as well as to understand. Okay, give me a moment to actually correct this one. Types, subtypes. Okay, all right, so we have here, so let's move this properly. So type 1, development as process. This is again, it's not a category because we are using a different term here. So excuse my mistake, update, and here we have another type, because it would be confusing if we have 2 or 3 different notes with different terms. So let us stick to just one. So type 1, development as process. This is where you create something new or modify or destroy old ones. So there are two subtypes. Development as easy. This is where from zero to something. From not having a phone, for example, to having a landline phone. And then the second subtype for the first type is development as modernity. So this is where you have from something to better. For example, from having a landline, now we have mobile phones or smartphones. Actually, we have mobile phones first, and then only we go to smartphone. So let's change this one. It's not smart, it is mobile phone, because mobile phones and smartphones, in terms of concept, they are different. Yeah, so we talk about mobile phone first. So that is type 1, development as process. And then type 2, we have development as intention. So what does it mean by this? When development requires purposes, aims, and when this development needs policies. 3 subtypes under development as intention. The first one, development as control. So basically, you have to control the development that you are doing. So what do we control? We control the people, we control the finance, as well as we control the security. And then the second subtype is development as empowerment. This is where you give knowledge. Knowledge is power to people. So for example, you build schools. Very important to have schools. And the last subtype under development as intention is development as discourse. So what does it mean by this? This is where policies are discussed. This is where policies are debated, and then they are approved. And this only happens in the parliament if you're talking about Malaysia. So 2 types of development as process with 2 subtypes, development as easy, development as modernity. And then we have the second type of development, which is development as intention, and 3 subtypes under development as intention: development as control, development as empowerment, and development as discourse. So that's types of development. Now, later on, I'm going to add categories of development according to our discussions and according to our module. But before we go into that, because that's quite easy, let's talk about the dimensions of development. Dimensions of development. We have 7 dimensions of development, and this must be explained in order. It must be explained in order. The first one, context. What is context as a dimension of development? It is the framework of your development. So when you have a framework, you have some sort of a plan, what to do after this, and then what happened. So that is the framework that you are going to use. The second dimension is actually the explanation. Why are you doing the development? Why must you build, for example, a house? Why must you build a factory, for example? And the third one is epistemology. Epistemology is knowledge. In order for you to build something, in order for you to do something, you must have the knowledge. The fourth one is methodology, ways or methods of doing something, of developing something. Number 5, representation. What is representation? Another word for that would be meaning. So for example, if you say, oh, I'm building this in order to empower students. So basically you are building a school. So what does it represent, this school? What does it represent? It represents the social needs of community. It represents the importance of education or importance of knowledge. So all those, that's the meaning of representation. The sixth one, or the second last, would be imagination. Of course, when you do development, you have to be critical, you have to be creative, but must be logical. You must be creative and innovative, but everything must be logical. There's no point of you to have this imagination. You say, oh, I want to build a school in the sky. In the sky. So can you imagine Is it logical to build a school in the sky? So where are you going to hang the school? So that is the meaning of imagination. Creative, innovative, but at the same time must be logical. Last but not least, under the dimensions of development would be future. When you talk about the future, you must talk about sustainable development. So whatever that you build today must be able to be maintained for at least 10, 20 years. There's no point of building a school today, it collapses tomorrow. So that's the meaning of future. You must have this. So dimensions of development, we have 7. We have context, explanation, epistemology, methodology, representation, imagination, and future. Now, let's talk about trends in development. Trends in development. So basically, we have 6 pairs. How do you explain these pairs, basically? So first, we have development before the 1990s. This is where before the end of the Cold War. And then you have the trend after the 1990s. This is when the Cold War ended. So we are going to explain this in terms of the pair. The easiest would be singular before and plural after. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you really have to understand these pairs, they are not in order. So you can explain in any order or sequence that you understand. But the easiest would be singular and plural. And then we have Eurocentrism to polycentrism. And then you have a generalizing to differentiating. And then you have macrostructure to agency or actor orientation. And then you have determinism. And then contingency. And last but not least, structuralism before and after constructivism. So basically what happened, ladies and gentlemen, before the 1990s, there's only one rule. There's only one policy. There's only one color that everybody must follow. There's only one cultural practice. But after the 1990s, when some of the countries gained independence by the USSR, now known as Russia, then they are free to act based on their preference, based on their cultural practices. So instead of one, for example, Eurocentrism, in terms of cultural practice, we have polycentrism. We have many cultural practices. In terms of one rule or one government body, for example, macro structure, macro is one huge one, to actor orientation or agency. Agency means being independent. So that's the meaning of before and after in terms of trends in development. Now, let's have a look at sustainable development. So basically, sustainable development, it is a balanced development. Don't forget this, ladies and gentlemen. Sustainable development is a balanced development. And there are 3 pillars in order for us to have this balanced development. The first one, environment. The second one, economy. And then society. So when we have these 3, we have sustainable development. We have a balanced development. And then let's talk about ICT and development. Here we talk ICT and cultures, and here we talk ICT and development. What are the impact or what are the effects of development when you talk about ICT and development? So basically, ICT facilitates development, and this is where more people become creators and not just users. Now, if you have heard of the term gig economy, you will realize that a lot of youngsters today, they start to become, for example, content creators or creative creators. All of this, they are part of this ICT and development, especially after the pandemic, or during the pandemic itself. It started a little bit before that, and then it started to be strengthened during the pandemic, and then after that still continues when you are talking about becoming content creator or creative creators. So this is where the effects of ICT onto development, where it of course facilitates development. For example, now we use a lot of algorithm, AI for example. Now we have make things easier. If you want to build something, you don't have to manually calculate everything. You can just use whatever software or systems available online, and then more people become creators rather than just users. So that's the major effects or impacts of development by ICT. Okay, now before we look at the categories of development, this is where I'm going to start writing or typing. Let's have a look at communication and development. This one here, communication and development. So when you want to talk about developing understanding, so this is where you have to have communication. You must not have misunderstanding when you communicate. So that's number one. Number two, communication is culturally biased. The way you say something, the way you perceive something, they are influenced by your culture. And next, communication is to ensure all types of development happen. For example, if you want to build a house, you need to communicate with the contractor. If you want to build or to nurture a child's development, you have to communicate to the child about the importance of whatever that you are trying to explain. So communication is very critical when you talk about development. Now there are three trends basically that are interrelated when you talk about communication and development. First, you have to develop communication. And once you have developed the communication, you must have the skills in order for you to become successful people. And third, interrelated to that would be that skills for communication must be used appropriately, and then when you have to use the skills, of course, to communicate. So we have to look at what is communication. Basically, ladies and gentlemen, when you talk about communication, what is communication? Communication is when at least two persons who are talking or who are communicating, and they share the same topic or the same message. So that's very important. Sometimes you see two people talking, but unfortunately they are not communicating simply because they do not share the same topic or the same message. So if you talk about communication, meaning to say one person is talking about topic A, and the person listening to that will respond about topic A. It's not about other topics. So that's the trends. Developing communication leads to skills that you must have in order to become successful people or successful communicators, and then it goes to the skills that you have developed must be used for communication and to communicate. Now I'm going to add one more, which is the categories of development. So basically we have a lot. We have social development, and then we have economic development, and then we have physical development, and then we have intellectual, or also known as cognitive development, and then we have political development. So these are some of the examples. Of course, there are many others, and I'm sure that, so this is actually green. Okay, so publish. So basically, where is it? Must be somewhere here. Okay, so basically when you talk about categories of development, this is it. This is the categories of development, or maybe it should be somewhere here. Let me just do a little bit of arrangement. Now don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to print this in a PDF format. So when you listen to this explanation, listen to this video, you can quickly look at the notes shared on PDF. So we have types of development, we have categories of development, we have dimensions of development, we have trends in development, and then we have smaller topics, sustainable development, communication and development, as well as ICT and development. So ladies and gentlemen, with that, I guess that's all for our revision video, and hopefully you are able to listen to this. Don't forget to stop or pause if you are not sure of anything. If you want to check anything, you can check with our module or with the notes that I'm going to give to you, the PDF format of this Padlet. And as usual, should you have any questions, if you're not sure of anything, do not shy away. Please ask. It's very important for you to really understand what is it that we are doing, so that your final can be completed successfully, inshallah. So with that, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum and greetings to all once again, and I'll see you in our next and maybe final class. Bye for now.